Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you all. I've launched a little poll for us to get some data since our speaker is in Annenberg. We'll have some data. I'm Zach Lesser, faculty director of the seminar, which I co-direct along with John Pollack, who's curator of research services at the Kislak Center.
Hi, folks.
And Jerry Singerman, humanities editor at the Penn Press, where he runs the material textbook series. Textbook series, among other things, that's connected to the seminar. Hi, Jerry. And Philip Mogan, Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts.
Hi, everyone.
Well, I'm really excited for tonight's talk by Jessa Lingel. We had it on the schedule for last spring, but had to cancel, and I'm really glad Jessa agreed to reschedule this fall in our Zoom seminar. Jessa is an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn, and in the School of Arts and Sciences. She's also core faculty in the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and affiliated faculty in Cinema and Media Studies. And her work across schools and programs, I think, highlights the interdisciplinarity of her research and teaching. Her work focuses on digital culture and its relation to politics and the possibilities for social change. She's the author, somehow already, of 3 books. In 2017, she published Digital Countercultures and the Struggle for Community with MIT Press, which explores how countercultural and marginalized communities have made the internet meet their needs. Earlier this year, Princeton published An Internet for the People, The Politics and Promise of Craigslist, which we'll learn more about tonight. And forthcoming in April 2021 from the University of California is The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Freedom, which outlines actions that we can take to reclaim what she calls the heady possibilities of the early internet from the increasing dominance of business. Finally, I feel like I'd be letting you all down if I didn't mention that before she came to Penn, Jessa worked as a digital media librarian at MTV. So maybe we can hear more about that later. Welcome, Jessa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Zachary, and for Philip for help coordinating. I'm really delighted to get to share my work. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. But I just really invite you to submit any questions. I don't know if we're using the chat or the Q&A for that, but just happy to field whatever questions I can about the project and to chat a little bit about the side of it that I don't always get to talk about. So as was just mentioned, earlier this year, I published my 2nd book, An Internet for the People, with Princeton University Press. So I thought today I'd tell you just a little bit about where the book comes from. And then I'm excited to use this talk as a way of working through one of the most distinctive components of Craigslist, which are its aesthetics and its material form. So first off, just to answer some questions that I often get about this project, like why would you write a book about Craigslist? So there's a few key reasons. First off, because in internet years, Craigslist is the old man on the block. It's based in San Francisco. It started off as an email listserv in 1995, and then it went online in 1996. So this is the original headquarters. You're seeing that image here on the right. And then for some context, that means that Craigslist was online an entire decade before Facebook, about 3 years before Google. So basically almost as soon as people were going online, Craigslist was there to help them do everyday things. And very quickly, Craigslist became very popular, and it's still very popular. So it's been in the top 20 most viewed websites in the United States for the last 10, 15 years. It has today, right now, it has more monthly visitors than the New York Times or than ESPN. So a pretty important, pretty popular website. And it's popular with a lot of people, but it's also very popular for me personally. So in my family, among my friends, I am known for buying and selling things on Craigslist. What kind of stuff can you get on Craigslist? You can get some awesome patio furniture. This is my patio furniture. That chair I bought on Craigslist. That dresser next to it, I later sold on Craigslist. There's another nice chair that I bought on Craigslist. That coffee table I bought and then later sold on Craigslist. You can get trees, y'all. I bought this ficus tree on Craigslist, and it was just a little sapling. And this is my current phone. I also bought on Craigslist, like 2 blocks away from my house. So Craigslist, you can use it to buy and sell. I buy and sell things all the time. Zachary mentioned that I used to be a librarian at MTV. People often think I have some fun, cool story of how I got that job. That fun, cool story is I answered an ad on Craigslist. So it's really been an important resource in my life for getting furniture and also jobs in my mid-20s. So Craigslist isn't just popular and it isn't just old, it's also incredibly stable. So it's stable financially in that it's a privately held company. It's never had more than 3 shareholders. And currently shares are controlled entirely by 2 people, founder Craig Newmark, who's over there on the left. He has an affinity for pigeons. And current CEO Jim Buckmaster, who's there on the right. Jim Buckmaster's been at the helm for the last 2 decades, so there's a ton of stability in terms of his company's leadership. But Craigslist is also very stable aesthetically, and that's sort of what I want to spend most of my time today talking about. So you may have played the Wayback Machine game, which is when you want to know what a website looked like, say, in the 1990s. So we can do this with my school, Annenberg, Annenberg School for Communication at Penn. Here is the website in 1998, right, courtesy of the Wayback Machine. This is the entire internet looked like this. You might be old enough to remember a time when the entire internet looked exactly like this. Here, the website's getting a little bit sexier over in 2003, and then now our current website looks like the rest of the internet, right? Right. You can't play this game with Craigslist. You cannot play the Wayback Machine game with Craigslist, because if you try, you get this page from 1998. Looks a little bit different, I grant you, by 2008, but I dare you to spend a whole bunch of time finding the difference between this 2008 and this 2018 site, right? It's basically the same platform. It really has been very limited in terms of its changes. And so this was a thing that when I talked to Craigslist users, they would talk about quite often. So we have Yima saying, I think it's kind of fun because it's more stark. It's just the listings and you click. And then a participant named Nick says, it seems like somewhat old fashioned to me now because it's very straightforward, which I like. It's a simple interface. It's easy to use. I don't know. I guess just that it feels like the old internet a bit. And then this is a tech journalist, Justin Peters, saying, for people who remember Web 1.0, the nostalgia factor is definitely meaningful. I have to imagine if Craigslist remains viable and presumably profitable, it's not just meant for me, who's been online for 25 years, but must be some young people around who are using it not out of any nostalgia for something they remember, but are using it because it works. And then also because secondarily, it reminds them of some sort of past that they know existed, but never actually got to experience, like children of the 80s going to 1950s themed diners. So I'm very interested in this idea of Craigslist as this sort of time capsule of an earlier internet, and it has stayed incredibly stable while the rest of the internet has changed. And in that sense, my claim here, and really one of the core claims of the book, is that Craigslist has mostly stayed the same while the internet around it has changed. So in that sense, Craigslist is like an island in the middle of a constantly shifting socio-technical ocean. So the argument is that if we're interested in thinking about how the internet has changed, one strategy is to look at a fixed point and to consider how its policies and practices get read against the grain of changing norms. So really the book is asking, what are the norms of Craigslist that become strange when we look at the rest of the web, and how can thinking about Craigslist norms and uses and aesthetics help us build a critique of socio-technical paradigms? So I wanted to talk a little bit briefly about what my methods are for the book as a whole, and then talk a little bit about methods for thinking about materiality of digital texts. And then if there's time, sort of getting into a comparison between Craigslist and one of its rivals in terms of its materiality. So I'm a qualitative researcher. So like most of my projects, the real workhorse of gathering data for this project was semi-structured interviews with two groups of people. Ordinary Craigslist users, there's 36 people who bought and sold on Craigslist, who also found work and used their now defunct personal section. And then I talked to insiders and experts. So I talked to people who had been involved in Craigslist since its early days, including its founder, Craig Newmark. And then also folks like tech journalists, legal experts, and some law enforcement experts about Craigslist's role in the larger digital landscape. Then I did some textual analysis, which is what I'll talk about if I get the chance here. And that was of a number of sources. So Craigslist has a blog that's penned by current CEO Jim Buckmaster. So I read all 300 blog posts there. It also has a help forum online that has tens of thousands of posts. So I scraped the help forum for a sample of what people talk about when they talk about problems on Craigslist. Hopefully I'll get a brief chance to talk about Craigslist TV, which is a YouTube channel with videos about Craigslist. So I watched all of those. There's also a forum on Reddit dedicated solely to Craigslist, which I analyzed about the Craigslist personal section, which I probably won't get a chance to talk about, but maybe you can bring it up in the Q&A. And then something that I call mashup blogs, which are basically blogs that people create in order to memorialize or play with or experiment with or make fun of Craigslist in different ways. So an example of that would be haiku, a mashup blog of haiku based on Craigslist ads, right? I do some critical legal analysis. Like most companies, Craigslist has been sued from time to time. So I've done an analysis of some of their, what I think are the more important court cases. And then unusually for me, I don't usually do quantitative work, but I did a, by my standards, very large survey of 91 people, just trying to get a sense of what average Craigslist users, how they use the site, what parts of the site are important or not. Okay. So I want to pause for just a second and talk a little bit about methodology when it comes to digital platforms. And I'm not totally sure what the familiarity level of the audience here is with these different tools. So I thought I'd just go fairly quickly, but I'm happy to come back to any of these platforms if people want to chat about them in terms of what are the tools that you can use to analyze digital texts in terms of their aesthetics and in terms of their materiality. So the main tool that we use, I've already mentioned, is the Wayback Machine. And that's created by the Internet Archive. And basically it just pings random URLs around the internet and archives them for use later. So if you want to, make fun of what Annenberg's website used to look like, or if you're doing, serious analysis of what Craigslist looked like. I've also used the Wayback Machine in the past to sort of analyze changes to a terms of service or a license agreement that a platform has with its users. And the drawbacks of the Wayback Machine, for one, it's probably overused by internet researchers such as myself because it's publicly available and fairly easy to use. The drawbacks are that you're completely at the mercy of a random archiving strategy. So the URLs that the Wayback Machine captures are totally random. So you can't guarantee that the page you want will be there from the time period that you want it. The other drawbacks, even if you might have noticed when I was looking at the Craigslist URL from 1998, is anything with an image or a video, it's a real crapshoot whether or not that will be preserved in a way that you can still display. So in that sense, if you're interested in using the Wayback Machine to think about the aesthetics of a text-heavy platform, you're in good shape. But if it's image-heavy, audio-heavy, or video-heavy, then you're really in trouble because there's no guarantee that those images will be preserved. So for that reason, I like to use a tool called Conifer, which is created by a tech archive or a tech collective in New York called Rhizome. And Conifer helps, Conifer is what I use. I mean, in the old days when I first started doing but in my old days of doing this work like 10 years ago, you would just print screen, right? Or you would just like save the HTML of a website and then hope that you could use it later. Conifer is a much more reliable way of capturing content. So it is very good at preserving all of the material, including audio and visual material. And obviously the drawback with Conifer is the same as the next tool I'll talk about briefly, Tropy, which is that there's no historical component, right? So you can't like say, I want to go back and see CNN's website for the past 10 years. You can only capture what you yourself have gathered. So it has no like backward looking platform. And the other thing is I happen to have a library degree, so I don't really mind coming up with an archiving plan ahead of time to organize content that I capture. But if you're not trained as a librarian or an archivist, coming up with a strategy for managing content can be a little bit overwhelming, and you really need that to get the most of this tool. Same with Tropy. The advantage of Tropy is that it was really developed for researchers. And it's meant as a tool for capturing visual material. I personally haven't used it, but the advantage of being a Penn person using it is that it's supported by our library. So people at Van Pelt can help you use that tool. And I'm excited going forward. I teach qualitative methods for graduate students at Annenberg. Although open to other folks if there's other Penn students who want to take it. So I'm looking forward to playing around with Tropy in classes that I teach on qualitative methods. So hopefully that brief crash course was somewhat useful for people who are interested in doing internet studies work, thinking about aesthetics and materiality, but I'm happy to talk about these in more depth if you would like. So I will talk a little bit about Craigslist design aesthetics, and then very briefly talk about how those shape up with some of its competitors. So truth be told, it's kind of hard to describe Craigslist design as actually having any sort of deliberate aesthetic, given that the site still looks much as it did in the late 1990s. And that was a time when programmers were still very limited in terms of their visual sophistication. So when I said that the entire internet looked this way, or really the entire web looked this way in the late 1990s, it's because that was simply the limit of the technical capacity of web pages at the time. But even 10 years later, in 2009, which I would argue was when Craigslist popularity was peaking, Wired magazine ran a series of articles about Craigslist, including an invitation for designers to give the site a makeover. And this actually resulted in a South by Southwest panel with redesigns offered of Craigslist material form. And complaints at the time about Craigslist have held pretty steady into when I was talking to Craigslist users for this book. And they describe Craigslist's aesthetic as cluttered, claustrophobic, and confusing, complaining that the site had too much text and too many links and lacked a clear organizing principle. And the revisions mostly focused on making Craigslist cleaner, prettier, and easier to use on a mobile phone. So if you want to see what some of those reimagined Craigslist look like, there's this one on the left that was focused on more friendly design, and this one on the right, which was focused on making it prettier. My personal favorite is this one, which was focused on moving links around so that you could make it look like founder Craig Newmark, which didn't take off. So none of these imaginings from South by Southwest took off. If Craigslist had listened to these complaints at Wired and by the South by Southwest panel, it would look a lot like a platform called Garage Sale. One of many companies currently competing for Craigslist market share, along with Facebook Marketplace, eBay, which is a long time competitor, freer stuff, all sorts of different platforms and apps. But I want to talk about Garage Sale. So it was founded by Tammy Zuckerman, an elementary school teacher in Montreal, and she was pregnant with her first kid. And then she asked her husband, who was a programmer, to build basically a mom-friendly Craigslist. She never quite calls it that, but it's pretty clear who her frame of reference is. It's unclear how many users they have. They just say that it's in the millions, and it's largely based in North America, but the platform has been very successful. So it has moved from Montreal to Toronto. It was named Startup of the Year in the Canadian Startup Awards in 2014. And then in 2017, it was acquired by a company called Vertical Scope. So it's still privately held, owned by another private company. And I found out about Garage Sale when I was in Canada for a conference, and there was actually a television commercial for Garage Sale. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, wow, this is a Craigslist for women. And you can see that in terms of how they sort of, the aesthetics and the material choice, or the aesthetics choices that they make in terms of the platform itself, and then also how it's marketed. So I'm interested in drawing on Sian Nagai's work on cuteness to sort of think about Garage Sale's aesthetic choices, which tend to use animation and soft color palettes in their depictions of mostly women customers. And Garage Sale's cuteness sort of reflects its complicated relationship to women, and more narrowly to middle-class heteronormative women, alternately emphasizing empowerment through buying and selling, and the idea that they need to be protected because buying and selling things in real life is fundamentally unsafe. So I sort of look at, to set up a comparison between the two, using two sets of texts. One is their LinkedIn pages, sort of comparing their decisions on their LinkedIn pages, and the other is comparing their YouTube channels. For reasons of time, I'm only going to get into the YouTube channels. I also happened to point out one time to Craig Newmark that his LinkedIn page for Craigslist was really wacky. And then about 2 weeks later, I went back and I found that he had changed, it had changed, right? So it was no longer as wacky as it had been. And that is why you have to archive the platforms that you are studying, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have captured the kookiness of LinkedIn, right? Right. So what are these aesthetic comparisons I keep talking about? So Craigslist YouTube channel, in a way, this entire talk is just for me to get to talk about Craigslist TV, which is 2 seasons of episodes that ran from 2010 to 2012. And every episode profiles a different Craigslist user. And my favorite is episode number 204, where Daniel draws on 20 years of experience as a bartender in order to be your drinking buddy for the night. So he wrote this ad, right, where he would be your drinking buddy, and you was just sort of, all you'd have to do is buy him a drink, and then he would just be your buddy for the night. And it was actually incredibly moving, right? So someone who had just broken up with his girlfriend just sort of used him as a sounding board because his friends had all taken sides. Someone else in Los Angeles had a roommate who was covering everything in saran wrap, and he just wanted to kvetch about it. You know, someone else was sort of talking about just like being new in Los Angeles and needing more friends. So Dave was really my favorite episode, but every episode sort of has its own little quirky Craigslist ad story to tell. And what was important to me about this is that for a website that's based on anonymity, so using Craigslist, all users are anonymous by default, there's something deeply compelling about this sudden access to the faces and the voices and the apartments of ordinary Craigslist users. And you get to see the everyday lives of people behind these pretty kooky ads. And so what's happening here is that there is a vision of the internet being presented by Craigslist TV, and it more or less sets out to prove Craig Newmark's entire worldview about the internet, that it's a place for quirkiness, it's a place where people are mostly good to each other, it's a place where ordinary people can get ordinary things done with their lives. In that sense, Craigslist TV signals a return to an earlier, wackier internet, portraying Craigslist as quirky and serendipitous, sort of central casting for the internet's oddballs. Not depicted in the ads are scams, fraudsters, prostitutes, or criminals. And you can even sort of see that in the aesthetic choices made in the Craigslist TV marketing, where you sort of have this 1990s emphasis on neon colors, on, I don't have it here, but even the font that they sort of use sort of feels like a TV show about like Friends. It's this depiction of an early internet set of values that Craigslist is trying to hold on to, because if you don't have that sort of optimism about the internet, you won't want to use a platform like Craigslist, where it's anonymous and sort of viewed by later internet standards as scary. We can contrast that with some of the choices made in the YouTube portrayals of garage sale. And what you see in the garage sale choices are these, animated cartoons. Again, they emphasize women. There's this like sort of guy's idea of cuteness as portraying these soft colors, these things that are in need of caring. That's what you see in Craigslist and in garage sale. And the image of the internet that is presented is something very different, where anonymity is bad, and it's particularly bad for women. Women are in need of a platform that is more caring, a platform that is safer, a platform that can sort of ensure that they are protected. And you don't just see that in the policies that Garage Sale has, where you have to use Facebook, for example, to log in, and or if you want to buy and sell. The ads are moderated by other users as opposed to Craigslist, which are relies entirely on a flagging system. And then in the actual aesthetics of the YouTube channel for Garage Sale, which is entirely consists of commercials for Garage Sale, you see these like cutesy portrayals of women, often with this sort of emphasis on diversity, buying and selling things that suburban women would sort of buy and sell. The only ads on the YouTube channel that are not animated are ads depicting heteronormative couples where the mom is in control of the household, and there are these dopey dads who want to use a platform like Craigslist, inviting criminals in to sell them a chainsaw. Like that's literally an ad that they use, right? So the aesthetic choices that are being made here set up a very different vision of the internet. So it might seem like I am setting up Craigslist as this sort of white knight meant to save us all from evil corporate profiteers, or perhaps that I'm nostalgic for a simpler, purer internet. The fact that Craigslist has kept its look, its feel, and its core features intact for almost 3 decades, to me, as an internet studies researcher, makes it a useful object of study in relation to a changing set of digital cultures. But it doesn't make it perfect. Although I argue that there are democratic values in maintaining a simple design, I definitely don't want the entire internet to look like Craigslist. But what I do want is to consider what it means to have a site like Craigslist endure on the web for so long, and to think about how its policies and user practices can help us understand important changes in online politics. So there's so much more that I could share about Craigslist, but I know these talks are usually only half an hour or even shorter. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it there and just invite whatever questions or feedback you have, and really looking forward to your questions about Craigslist.
Thanks, Jessa. That was great. So as usual, we can use the raise hand function, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself, or if you like, you can put comments and questions in the chat. So the floor is open. I wonder, just while we're waiting for some hands to go up, Jessica, one site that sort of, to me, feels at least superficially similar is Wikipedia, in the kind of ethos, and also somewhat in the design, although I don't know if you would, I don't know, can you talk about how you might compare those? Like, is there a little group of sites that are kind of in this category of sort of more 1.0?
I think Wikipedia is a really smart comparison. They really share a similar set of values and a similar set of ideas about how the internet can work. And it's not unusual for companies of that age to believe that. It's just unusual for them to have made it. So Wikipedia has a similar set of values, and also in some ways a similar set of problems, right? Like Wikipedia is sort of beset by a sort of misogyny on the platform. It is technically it's weird. It's so basic that it has become, in a weird way, like outdated, but it's still being used by this core group of users. So I guess what I would say about both of them is there's a Wired article about Craigslist. I sort of mentioned there was a series of Wired articles about Craigslist in 2009 that talked about Craigslist as a monopoly that has users locked in at a price of $0. And that is true. Craigslist is free for most people to use. And Wikipedia is also a monopoly that sort of has people locked in because it was just the most successful version of itself that survived, right? So they were competing. It captured market share at a time that was very influential in digital culture. If you had to create either one of those platforms now, it wouldn't work. But they also, they share similar. In some ways they share similar origin stories, like just like tech guys who are the different generation of tech guy than the tech guys we have now, who were sort of like seeing the world in terms of problems to solve. And certainly Craig Newmark has made a lot of money on the platform, unlike the creator of Wikipedia, but it was never intended to create money. But yeah, they were created by a similar ethos of early 90s internet values. And I guess I would just, yeah, if you had to create them now, you probably couldn't. But they've held on because they sort of like created market share. They captured market share at a pivotal time in digital culture history, I would say.
Great. Whitney, go ahead. Jessa, maybe I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen just so we can all see more people or bigger people. Go ahead, Whitney.
Thanks. And thanks for your talk, Jessa. That was great. I had a question about the infrastructure or hardware of Craigslist, because, you're talking about the design, and I'm thinking about this from a particular angle, which is like, there are some digital humanities projects that are like these open source repositories, right? I'm thinking about something like Humanities Commons, but they're all built now on Amazon Web Services, of course. And I'm wondering if, like, how far down the Craigslist ethos of, DIY, keep it low tech, like, are they building their own servers, or, does it go to the level of infrastructure, or does it just kind of stay at the level of design?
So there's only so much that I can answer that question, but what I would say is, so Craigslist started out as an email listserv that Craig was running. And so Craig would sort of just like gather emails of people who were interested in technology in the Bay Area in the 1990s. And then he would sort of run these regular, like a listserv, which he coded himself in Pine and in SQL. And then he had to migrate it to a website in 96 because he had too many emails to continue programming, right? So the difference is partly that even when Jim Buckmaster took over, they are both engineers. Like almost everything that makes Craigslist different from other platforms can be, in some ways, I'm being a little glib, but it can be explained as they're not entrepreneurs, they're engineers, and they like engineering problems. So Garage Sale has 10 employees and Craigslist has about 50, and all they're doing is maintaining the infrastructure that they have, right? They're not designing new things. If you look on the Craigslist recruitment page, they're like, are you tired of pivots? Are you tired of like being told you have to design things in sprints? Come to Craigslist. You don't have to do any of that. You just have to maintain the system that we have. So I don't know. I would be very surprised if they didn't have their own servers. And I am sure it's partly a political and ethical decision, but also partly because it's a company that really likes engineering problems. It's just like when I first met Craig, I was like, oh, you are an engineer. Like you're a tech nerd engineer that I have met through working in tech many times, right? Like it's this kind of archetype. So there, as I noted before, Craig has gotten wealthy, and so is Jim Buckmaster. But fundamentally, they're just engineers who maintain control to the extent possible. Both because they've been doing it for so long, so they're not having to they're just the tools that you're talking about, like Amazon Web Services just simply weren't available in the 90s when they were building it, but also just because they're engineers who like tackling those problems, and that seems to be the kind of people that they've gathered at Craigslist now.
Sonia Drimmer, go ahead.
Thanks so much for this talk. My question is partly due to the fact that I don't use Craigslist much anymore, but I'm wondering whether you've looked into and whether there have been instances of users who try to create listings that defy the simplicity of the platform itself. So, fighting against the required mise en page, and giving it more not a technical term, but like bells and whistles than it can handle or is meant to handle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that question. So there's a couple ways of answering it. The one is like, if you go back to Craigslist personals, or if you look at Craigslist personals, it's like it got their start before there were photos, right? So you couldn't upload photos. So people just were very text heavy. So you want an elaborate ad. I mean, you go back to those early personals ads and they were incredible. People were writing novels, just like very long descriptions, right? So, but there's another, probably a more apt way of describing what you're talking about, which is one of the things that Craigslist has really come under attack, the most famous thing that Craigslist has come under attack for is not keeping users safe, right? So in 2009, there was like a high profile murder on Craigslist, the so-called Craigslist killer, Philip Markoff, who attacked two women and murdered one woman in the Boston area. And so after that, Craigslist's reputation really fundamentally changes, right? So that's its main set of complaints about Craigslist. But there's another set of complaints that people like the EFF, the Electronic Freedom Frontier Foundation, have. And that is that Craigslist goes after people who try to game Craigslist ads. So for example, if I am willing to travel anywhere to find, I don't know, like a 1996 Jeep Wrangler, if I really want a Jeep Wrangler and I don't just want one in Philadelphia, I'm willing to go anywhere to get one. And I want to write a script that will search Craigslist ads across the country for that. That is using Craigslist data in a way that's against the terms of service, and Craigslist will go after you for that, right? Like, so Craigslist does not like it when you do that, and they have gone after users or companies that have tried to do that. So I don't know if anyone was apartment hunting circa 2008, but you might have used a tool called Pad Mapper. And all that did was scrape Craigslist rental listings. And this was when Craigslist didn't have a map function. So it just like scraped the Craigslist ads and put them on a Google map. Well, Craigslist sued 3Taps, the company that owned PadMapper, for doing that. And then they had to pay $1 million to EFF, actually. It was the lawsuit, how that was settled. So that is an instance of people trying to make Craigslist more complicated in a way that Craigslist really does not like. And so that's a really good challenge. Like, I'm setting Craigslist up as this like early internet values and everything was better in the 90s and they just want things to be open, man. But it's fundamentally untrue, because they've actually gone after, users and people for doing that. Now, Craigslist's argument is all we have is the data, right? Like, all we have are our ads and our market share. Like, we don't have sophisticated design. So if someone is going to use our platform in a way that's against the terms of service, then that's fundamentally challenging our business model. There's actually, in the book, I talk about, like, there's actually a really important argument there about like the terms of service and what a platform's obligations are to its users. But I won't get into that. But that's one way of thinking about your question.
No, that was perfect. And the way that you answered it made me understand actually why I was asking the question that I was asking. So thank you.
No problem.
That reminds me to Sonia, your question reminds me to share the results of our poll, and you'll see that where I feel like we probably are a little under the norm for how much people use Craigslist in this crowd, but use more for buying than selling. I don't know if that's normal. That your answer also, I feel like, relates to a comment and question in the chat, which has to do with the relationship of Craigslist to print culture. Is Craigslist responsible for the demise of classified sections of local newspapers? And I guess I would extend that to say, given that local newspapers did used to depend very much on classifieds for their revenue, to what extent is Craigslist part of the loss of local newspapers around the country?
Yeah, so I think it was 2 years ago that Craig Newmark made like a $10 million donation to like CUNY School of Journalism, and journalists around the country were pretty salty about that, because Craigslist has so dramatically eaten into the classified ad budget of of most newspapers. So I will admit, until I started this project, and I used to, you'd hear about like the internet has killed newspapers. I always thought that that was about like competition from bloggers or competition for attention, or newspapers being too slow on the draw with their business models. Like if the New York Times had just demanded that people pay money in the 90s to visit the website rather than putting it out there for free, we'd be having a very different discussion. They didn't do any of those things. So I had this very different vision of how the internet was a threat, but it actually, in terms of economics, it was a threat because it took away classified advertising. And classified advertising makes up a huge percentage of the budget, particularly of local newspapers, much, much more so than the fancier kinds of advertising on Mad Men, right? Like classified ads are really the workhorse of newspaper budgets. And, Craig and Jim, well, particularly maybe Jim Buckmaster, there's like a kind of conspiracy theory that, or some sort of theory that like one reason media journalists are so angry about Craigslist or portray it in a negative light is because Craigslist took away their advertising budget, right? And so it is definitely true that Craigslist was a competitor, and there are economists who have done analysis that when Craigslist opened up in a new city, so when it created a new platform in a new city, that the advertising budget went down of that local newspaper. So that's definitely true. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made then, though, that for one, is that really Craigslist's fault, or is it the fault of these newspapers for not being able to come up with a better plan, right? Like, is it Craigslist's fault that they created a better classified ad, or was it the newspaper's fault for not seeing that the internet was coming and that they were going to have to come up with a better business model, right? So that's a pretty cutthroat response from someone who usually like claims Marxist feminism, but it is kind of true that like the internet was clearly here to stay, and so you at some point newspapers have to take some accountability. And another is that like, well, the media landscape is pretty complicated. So if you have something like Auto Trader, for example, like Auto Trader has eaten into the classified ad budget around used cars, right? Like with Auto Trader, suddenly the classified ad for used cars drops to nothing. Auto Trader is owned by Cox Media, which actually owns a bunch of local newspapers, right? So in that case, the media landscape is so complicated that it's sort of difficult to draw blame around one platform sinking and another set of platforms falling. So the short answer is yes, Craigslist has a lot to answer for in terms of classified ad budgets, but if it hadn't been Craigslist, it would have been someone else. And also, at least Craig Newmark is spending his money for charity, and a lot of tech entrepreneurs are not. So I don't mean to sound so defensive about Craigslist. It's more just like an argument that you encounter, and you sort of want to like make a little bit complicated in terms of being a communication scholar, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect many fewer households also have an encyclopedia set in their house now than before Wikipedia. So. Jerry, go ahead.
Also more accurate than most encyclopedias. So
yeah, this is really more in the way of thoughts and comments, maybe more than questions. One with the matter of classified ads, and the newspapers, remember, had been scooped and displaced to some extent by the penny shoppers, those things that you would pick up for free at the entrances to restaurants. So they were print classified sections that was stealing money away from or taking money away from the newspapers. Although I don't know on what scale, I don't know how widespread they were. The comparison of Wikipedia to Craigslist, if we can go back to it, I mean, it strikes me as a user that they're, except I'm not really a user of Craigslist. I mean, they're similar in that they're both ugly, right? But the thing that I notice about a Wikipedia page is the hierarchy. I mean, you know where to look for what. It's heavily formatted. The picture is in the upper right-hand corner. The fast facts about, when the person was born, how old they are, who they're married to, what their political affiliation, right? Is there an outline form? There's a table of contents, so you can like skip to, I don't know, scandals or whatever. And it's very, very easily navigable. The thing that strikes me so much about Craigslist is how it levels all differences, it levels all distinctions. So that in the earliest version, at least, there were those really ugly underlinings, right? The underlinings disappear. So it's all a sea of absolutely uniform type, which is kind of maybe telescoped by the fact that there are no uppercase letters in it. So everything is lowercase, which I find the kind of visual democratization or visual chaos, extremely interesting. But the further wrinkle that I didn't know about, which runs kind of counter, and I wonder what what your thoughts on. It's leveling all distinctions, except you've just told us it doesn't level the distinction of place, that it's fiercely localized, right? So the Philadelphia page is the Philadelphia page. The Baltimore would be Baltimore, and you're somehow breaking the rules if you cross over those geographical boundaries, which I find terribly interesting and puzzling somehow.
Yeah, Craigslist got its roots in San Francisco in the 1990s. And now we think of San Francisco as being like, of course, San Francisco is the tech epicenter. But actually, as someone who was living in California in the 1990s in the Bay Area, like San Francisco was not the tech epicenter in the 1990s. It was in the South Bay. And that it was a very, San Francisco was sort of more like this artsy, creative relationship to the internet, sort of people who are making like hypertext art and stuff, not the tech bros that we sort of envision now, the programmers, if you will. And so it started off with a local route, because that was like Craig's original vision, and then that just sort of became, as it spread, its sort of organizing principle. But one thing that's interesting, or two responses that I would have, is there's like a missing chapter of the book that I wanted to write that just didn't get written, about the different mapping projects that have been created with Craigslist. So they're actually in some ways these like really beautiful maps that Craigslist, that artists have made basically against Craigslist's terms of service, but they just never got shut down. That just play with different experiments. So if you're in Philly, I don't think polices its geographic boundaries quite as much, but in a city like New York or San Francisco, like the division between what is Park Slope and what is, Fort Greene, or what is Williamsburg, like these different disputes over where the borders are, right? You could portray that in a Craigslist map of apartment listings. So an apartment listing that might call itself Fort Greene because it doesn't want to be associated with a different neighborhood. You could see that portrayed in these maps of where the listings were. So there's all these sort of different map-based projects that have sort of played with this geographical boundary. And the other is, when I was interviewing people who had used Craigslist in different cities, they would sort of talk about how Craigslist reflects a set of local norms. It reflects a sort of vision of what the city is like. It's sort of a mixtape, or sort of time capsule of the city, a living time capsule of the city, in terms of what people are thinking about, or what people are buying and selling, or what kinds of apartments are for sale. And so in that sense, it sort of reflects the city in a particular way. I've even noticed that when I do talks about Craigslist in different cities, I always make sure that I look at the Craigslist ads of that city. And sometimes you do notice weird things. Like when I was in Brisbane, Australia, and I was giving a talk about Craigslist, the ads there for drugs are like, these are illegal ads for like, street drugs, right? Are all found in the baby section. So if you're trying to like buy or sell a stroller in Brisbane, Australia, be prepared to be disappointed, because it'll be, instead of the listing will be for a stroller, but the photo will be of like marijuana. And then there'll just be like the drug dealer's number, like written onto the photo, right? So it's like, in that sense, it's not text searchable. It's just, you go there. So the cities just sort of have these different, I've never seen that in another city. It's just the Brisbane drug dealers are like, we're going to go to Craigslist. And partly that, I have to admit, that is because the Craigslist outside the United States is largely used by expats. So some Australian drug dealer has just realized that Americans, people from the United States going to Australia are going to look on Craigslist apparently for strollers and then want to buy drugs. I don't know. But the different Craigslist is very similar in a lot of ways. And then if you really dig a little bit deeper, city by city, there are these different norms that sort of emerge with the platform. So you can read against the grain of Craigslist practices and sort of get this access to local culture that you would never imagine, given that the interface is exactly the same city by city.
Yeah, but following up, I'm talking about the mapping and local culture. I mean, how does it deal with the Eastern megalopolis where one town, one city bleeds into another? So, I mean, if you live in Princeton, New Jersey, right, which is a suburb both of New York City and of Philadelphia, does Princeton fall into both of those interlocking, or how
well,
are this
user would post in multiple? So if you're in the suburbs, Craigslist is not an ideal platform, right? Because it's very heavily skewed towards the city. So when I'm searching for stuff on Craigslist, you sort of have to like you can try and limit. You get frustrated sometimes by people in the suburbs trying to say like, oh, really they live in Kennett Square, but they're posting ads in Philadelphia, and you drive it because that's where the people are. So, but a smart user would post. If you're in Princeton, you would post in Philly, you'd post in New York, and then you'd also post in the Central Jersey platform. So Craigslist sort of lets that, you can flag that, right? If I were really annoyed as a user, like you're not in Philadelphia, you're in Kennett Square, or you're in Princeton, then I could flag the ad and say that it had been misposted.
But Jonathan Katz had a question.
Hi, Jessa. I was curious to sort of test out an idea regarding the affective dimension of the interface, because the steady stateness of it is, of course, really intriguing. And I wanted to sort of confess that part of the reason that I love it is because, unlike most interfaces, it seems that I'm in control.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of sort of sending things to me that allow me to open things up, it's all there. I can direct the experience and control exactly for what I'm interested in. I don't have to look at extraneous things, etc. So I'm wondering if, in some sense, what you're calling an old-fashioned model might represent actually a sort of an unmet need among those of us who surf the net for a more directed engagement.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about that in terms of affect, and I think that's true. I think it's partly what I was saying before about Craig and Jim having an engineering, function over form view. Like if you read Jim's blog post about why Craigslist is great, he will often talk about how fast it is, like how fast the results come back, or how lightweight the code is. I mean, these are very web engineer values of what makes a good platform, right? So that creeps into the affect of the platform, that it should be lightweight, it should be easy to use, it should be, that the fact that it's text-based makes it a good thing. Side note, I mean, if you ever look at the personal web pages of computer science professors, they look like Craigslist. They're just HTML of like, this is me, like it's like a monotone background, and it's just like everything's in like Times New Roman font, right? Like, and they know how to code, right? It's not that they can't create a prettier website. It's just that they're engineers, and they want their website to look that way for a reason. It reflects their engineering function over form value, right? So in that sense, the aesthetic reflects a certain affect. But the other thing you're tapping into, Jonathan, is sort of about the power dynamics of the platform and about its business model. And it both is speaking to you as someone who wants a more self-directed, autonomous experience of being online, and at the same time reflects an earlier business model of how the internet could operate. In that, the example that I use is Facebook. So a lot of people are unclear on how Craigslist makes money, and Craigslist makes money from a very small number of kinds of ads, right? So most people have never experienced paying for a Craigslist ad simply because you've never posted one of those ads. You've never been a furniture dealer. So if I'm selling my chair as an individual, I don't have to pay for the ad. If I'm a furniture store owner and I want to post my furniture, then I have to pay a small fee. You have to pay a fee if you live in certain cities and you're posting an ad. for an apartment, right? If you're a realtor, you have to pay for that. And job listings have always cost money on Craigslist. That's been their single greatest source of income. So whether you're posting an ad for an assistant at a bakery or in my case, a digital librarian at MTV, you have to pay $25 to post that ad, right? They've always charged that much money. So if you don't understand how Craigslist works as a Craigslist user, it's just because you've never been charged the fee. Whereas if you don't understand how Facebook makes money as a Facebook user, that's because Facebook doesn't want you to know, right? Like Facebook makes money by turning you into the product, right? Like Facebook makes money by monetizing everything you do on the platform. So both platforms feel free to most people, but for fundamentally different reasons. And in Craigslist case, it's because it has this very transparent, very stable, monetization scheme where it charges a small number of users for a small number of kinds of ads. Whereas Facebook feels free until you realize that nothing you do on that platform cannot be made into a product. So in that sense, Craigslist does speak to this desire to have more autonomy over your data, which is not sold to third parties on Craigslist, and certainly is on Facebook. And that is reflected in terms of its aesthetic and its sort of policy decisions.
Laura Adela, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for this talk. It's really interesting to go in this internet direction since we're usually back with the books in this group. And I have a very similar background to yours. I have my master's in library science as well as a doctorate, but I've been going much more in the route of doing development work myself in recent years. So that's where this question is coming from. And I'm interested in hearing more about your take on the role of gender in all of this, because, you know, you sort of contrasted Craigslist with the, what was the women-centric platform. And, you know, you were talking about safety issues and how that's sort of a gendered issue. But I mean, I was thinking in terms of the actual aesthetic, something you've been mentioning a lot, even in the Q&A, this like function over form thing. I know that like, there's a way in which in the tech world, this is genuinely an engineer kind of point of view, but it is also like, you know, what's now becoming kind of the old guys of tech, and it was mostly guys. And I mean, there's definitely a way in which in the development world, this like, we don't need the pretty stuff, we just have the function. There is a gendered valence to that. And it's explicitly, I'm like, you know, myself and other women who I know who code are told like, oh, you can do the pretty stuff, like whether we do back-end work or not, you know. So I just wondered how that kind of dynamic fits into how you're thinking about this, because it's just something, I'm sure it's something you've thought about as a feminist and an internet historian, but I'd be interested to hear more about kind of either in your conversations with the Craigslist people or just your ruminations about this aesthetic, which to me is both, yes, like all the things you said, nostalgia for a previous time and a kind of function over form, you know, straight engineering thing, but it also can be kind of a like, are you part of the boys club? Do you do like the guy thing? So I just wondered about that aspect of it and how you thought about it.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have thought a lot about gender on Craigslist, although not generally from that viewpoint. So there's a whole thing, and the deeper story about the comparison between Garage Sale and Craigslist is interesting to me because on the one hand, Garage Sale seems like it should be this feminist or sort of like post-feminist like vision of what the internet can be, right? And in as much as it's created by a woman, it wasn't created in, you know, Silicon Valley or San Francisco. It's created in Montreal, it's not one of Canada's like tech hubs, right? So it has this sort of origin story that has some of the ingredients for being a woman-centric vision of what the internet could be. And then if you dig a little deeper, the story gets a little bit more complicated because women in Garage Sale ads, like the sort of thing I'm gesturing there towards is that in its aesthetics, and it is portraying women as sort of like childlike, as in need of protection, as sort of like very focused on the home, right? Like what are women buying and selling on Garage Sale? Kids' clothes that their kids have outgrown, or they're selling their old purse to buy a new purse, right? So there's this very heteronormative vision of what women want out of the internet, and is a need that is not being met on Craigslist because it's too scary, because it's too anonymous, and is being met on a platform like Garage Sale. But your question is more about how Craigslist design sort of reflects sort of the tech industry's long-standing gender dimensions. And I don't know, I'd have to think about that question a little bit more, but what I can think of off the top of my head is there were some women who were very involved in Craigslist's early days, and that they reflect some of the choices that programmers who were women had to make in the 1990s of sort of either leaning into this, like, I'm just a programmer and my gender doesn't matter, when of course it does matter deeply in terms of who gets ahead and who doesn't. And then also some of the women who were involved in Craigslist's early days were involved because of their expertise in HR. And HR has always been a place in tech where women have been able to dominate. So when you look at the leadership of major tech companies, and tech companies are like, no, look at all these VPs that we have who are women. They're usually VPs of user experience or of HR, right? Because that's where women have the soft skills to succeed, and an engineer or a programmer could never have those soft skills, right? So in that sense, Craigslist has really battled with, on the one hand, I don't even have the full story on this, but like they had a CEO before Jim Buckmaster who was a woman, and then that sort of like didn't play out. And then they had some programmers who were involved in the early days who were women. So they had women who were involved in really important ways, but those histories sort of drop out of the few of us who are like really in deep in Craigslist history. Even I had to dig pretty deep to get to some of those stories, and I never got to them fully. So your question is a good one, and I'm only coming at it like slant a little bit, but I do think, as much as I portray Craigslist as like holding on to a vision of the internet that I think is worth thinking about, and to some extent sort of like recuperating, they do still reflect some of the most longstanding problems of the internet around diversity, around, inequitable gender roles. And you, now that you've asked the question, I certainly do think there's an argument you can see it in the design itself.
Thanks.
There's also, I can remember back when like graphical user interfaces started to take over Windows, there were these kind of computer nerdy friends of mine who refused to use Windows and just would use DOS, long after anyone was using DOS. And I think there's something here that's a long-standing concern in history of material text, right? Outside even of the digital, which is the relationship of text and image. Mm-hmm. And the way I could imagine that what I'm hearing is that there's in the digital realm anyway, there is a kind of gendered dynamic to the relationship of text and image, where the kind of hardness of all text, of coding, is coded more masculine. I don't think you could transpose that easily to the history of text and image in printing, but I think there's a kind of there's a sort of persistent structural question of the relationship between text and image that, it would be worth tracing across the print digital divide. I'm not asking you to do that now. It just came into my mind as something that this group has talked. We've seen many talks on print and image in print media, and even thinking about ballads or other print media that feature both text and image, and what the different dynamics are to an all print page like Craigslist versus, Garage Sale, which is heavily graphically oriented. But I want to get to Frederick Feldman also.
All right. Yeah, this was a really interesting talk. I'm hoping this comes out as a question and not word spaghetti. So, but I can't really speak to the Craigslist aspect. I'm more of an eBay user myself, but the Web 1.0 aspect is very fascinating to me, and what I'm thinking about, like paradigms that it fits into, and when you're talking about the aesthetics is really interesting to me. I grew up with kind of when the web was changing from 1.0 to 2.0, so it feels very formative. I definitely have that sort of nostalgic feeling for it, and the sense that it was more democratic, whether that's true or not. But I mean, how the Annenberg site looked like looks the same as sort of the web pages I could make as a teenager after a couple months of learning HTML. And I was thinking that, like with as you're saying, the Virage sale emphasizes safety, and it's very much a different sort of thing, the sort of commerce side of the web. When I think of the Web 1.0 is more of an information resource. I was thinking, what kind of did it fill for me in my mind? And thought maybe zines. Maybe zines is sort of what it did, because I would go on as a teenager interested in comic books and find, say, Sarah's X-Men page. I didn't know who Sarah was, and the presentation was very much degendered. It was just mostly text, maybe a couple images. So I was 13. She has a web page. It seems legit. I'll check it out. Follow all the links. And maybe at that time I would have bought a fan magazine at Target, but very quickly I didn't do that because I had the web. And nowadays I think it shifts more. Now you have wikis, which is maybe in a sense less personal and more community edited. But I'm really interested in what the aesthetic of 1.0 signals, because it's very striking when I see it now. And I'll see this on like outsider musicians sites, just like how you said the science professors and engineering professors will have these very stark websites. That's also true with this sort of do-it-yourself or outsider musicians. Their websites still look like this. And people were talking about how it's replaced classifieds, but there's like a lot it kind of replaces. How do you see it fitting, like the commerce aspect of Craigslist versus kind of Web 1.0 in a larger sense? What is that aesthetic that's like signaling?
Mm-hmm. The other way of doing this talk would have been to just talk about Craigslist as the digital extension of the classified ad. I started researching this book when I was at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, and I was doing a lot of the early research on the classified ad and sort of trying to think about how classified ads had changed over time. And the fact is, I had used Craigslist for many years without ever having thought of it as a classified ad, but Craigslist has always thought of itself as specifically a classified ad. Like the LinkedIn page that I was making fun of earlier, that has since been replaced, it just had the line, Craigslist is a classified ad company, like 6 times. That was the corporate description of Craigslist on LinkedIn, right? And so it thinks of itself in that way. And in that sense, it taps into the classified ad as having like always been this sort of like unique material form that has been incredibly stable for centuries. And it's also been very stable in terms of who it appeals to. Classified ads have always sort of invited a degree of skepticism or alarm because they were anonymous or because they were sort of like a platform that is mediated by someone else. And it was always a haven for queer people. It was always a haven for other folks who are marginalized in terms of their desires. And in that sense, Craigslist, unlike classified ads where you had to have like a small, you were charged by the characters, so you would sort of have this like lingo where you were sort of like trying to condense everything in the smallest possible text. Craigslist, suddenly you could have as much text as you wanted, which is why I was mentioning, these long novels that people would write. And you sort of got this sense of, it was like LiveJournal to sort of tap into another Web 1.0 mainstay. It's like these long entries that people were writing because they could, finally they sort of had this venue where you weren't hemmed in by a sort of the material constraints of a print newspaper. So in that sense, Craigslist and its roots in sort of like an economic form of like buying and selling, it's rooted first of all in the classified ad site and moving that online, but it was also constrained, and again very deliberately, by Jim and Craig just like believing that there's something worth holding on to in the 1990s aesthetic. But I believe that isn't just a nostalgia for the aesthetic, it's because it reflects a set of politics about access. So I won't get into this too much because we're running out of time, but I will say that one thing that is interesting about Craigslist is that it reflects a change in terms of what constitutes of whether openness is a good thing. So Craigslist sees itself as a good platform because it's a good thing to have on the internet because it's so open, because anyone can use it, anyone can log in. You don't have to tell the platform anything about yourself. You don't have to, hand over your data. Anyone can use it. It's truly open, right? And you can use it anonymously. You don't have to hand over anything. Over in the 1990s, that was a normal thing to bring to the internet. The idea that you could enjoy someone else's site about some sort of outsider music and you didn't have to know anything about them. You were just treating their text as text. They didn't need to be vetted by some external source. Over time, that kind of openness has come to be perceived as a threat. That's no longer a good thing in terms of transparency and democracy. That's a bad thing. It means people haven't been vetted. They haven't been, they're not trustworthy. Anonymity is bad. Transparency now is good in that you, the user, should be as transparent as possible to the platform, and the platform should be as opaque as possible to the user. And so in that sense, Craigslist really documents a fairly seismic change in how we view openness. So even again, the fact that Craigslist is just a bunch of text that people are throwing out there, they're not vetted, it's not sort of like filtered in any meaningful way, it's just sorted by date. So in that sense, Craigslist, and this goes back to Jonathan's point again, it puts all of the autonomy in the hands of the users, and Craigslist's leadership sees this as a good thing, whereas over the past 20 years, users have been sort of forced to see that as a bad thing. They've been, sort of conditioned to see that as a threat and a source of harm.
Let's get Catherine James in on the conversation.
Oh, right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. And my question really follows on from this previous one, that I was thinking about whether like 200 years from now, we would be collecting like a vintage Craigslist ad, and what the market for Craigslist as a kind of inventory receipt, this sort of social historical document might need. But really my question is, like, do the founders have an idea of Craigslist in like posterity, like a view of what they would want to save, or what the sort of gift to the future would be that they think they're doing in that way, in the way that as you say, the Internet Archive has this image of what people might want to see of previous iterations of the internet too.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I think, so sometimes people have asked, like, so does Craigslist look the way it does just out of attrition, or is that just like, how political is the decision to keep Craigslist the way it looks? And I think it is fairly political. I mean, I do think that certainly Craig, and from what I've read of his blog post, Jim feels that like Craigslist is worth holding on to because it reflects the needs of a certain group of people at a certain moment in time, sort of that archival dimension that you're talking about, but also it sort of like archives an ideology that they're very fiercely committed to. That said, you because of Craigslist's policies on scraping its platform, you're really at the mercy again of what random people are creating to archive Craigslist, right? So the mashup catalogs that I talked about, just these different sort of like humor projects, and in some cases artistic projects of Craigslist, are some of the best archives of Craigslist ads, right? And they're just random people on the internet saying, this is funny, or this is weird, or this is creepy. So two of my favorites, for example, are there's one called Westeros Personals, which is, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, it just mashes up a Craigslist Personals ad with a photo from Game of Thrones, right? So there would be like a Personals ad that was sort of like, hey, I'm just trying to save the world, mashed up with a photo of Jon Snow, right? So that's the whole Tumblr. It's just like, just personal ads from Craigslist mashed up with Game of Thrones, right? So this is an important archival document in as much as like it's preserving Craigslist and also this like pop culture moment where like everything was getting read through Game of Thrones. A more artsy project, which was actually turned into a book, is called Craigslist Mirrors. It's a Tumblr that is just people selling mirrors on Craigslist. And there are in some cases these like incredibly haunting images of mirrors, because if you've ever taken a photo of a mirror, that is like it's a sort of problem, right? There's like how do you manage like the reflection in the mirror? So it's this really, beautiful. I actually interviewed the artist who created Craigslist Mirrors. So it's this really beautiful, archive of people selling stuff on Craigslist, right? So, and that's the time capsule 200 years from now, people trying to get Craigslist ads, we're relying on them because Craigslist itself is very difficult because of its rules on how you can scrape its platform, which is to say that you can't. It's difficult to preserve, right? So you're at the mercy of researchers like myself and people who think Craigslist mirrors are fun to make a Tumblr out of, right? So this is not compelling for a historian, really, because it's totally idiosyncratic. And all I know of your question of like how deliberate Craig and Jim are is that they have a copy of Craigslist mirrors in their office. So,
Catherine, I think you should write to Craig Newmark on Twitter, in your official capacity, and see if he'll donate the servers.
Right. Donate to the Beinecke or to Penn, I guess. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jessa. This was a really fascinating talk and connected up to a lot of interesting topics in the history of this seminar, but from a completely new angle for us. So it was really great to have you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you all and answering your questions. Thank you.